I'm Paul Cowling with Film Independent, and welcome to the 2022 Film Independent Forum. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our wonderful sponsors for this program. Big thank you to the Directors Guild of America, SAG Indie, and Mississippi Film Office. We appreciate your continued support. Great to have you back. So this is the first of our virtual days at the forum. Over the next 3 days, we'll be releasing 3 pre-recorded sessions daily on the Thinkific platform where you're watching this now, plus 1 live streamed event every evening at 5:30 Pacific. And you'll have access to all the content until December 31st, 2022. Tonight, I'm thrilled to be introducing this keynote conversation. Joining us today is Bird Runningwater, who's well known to many indie filmmakers, especially regulars at the Sundance Film Festival. Bird, for many years, was head of the Sundance Institute's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Division, where he nurtured a new generation of filmmakers whose work put Indigenous cinema into the global marketplace. Now he's CEO of Cloud Woman Media, and he has a first look deal with Amazon Studios. Welcome, Bird. Step up here on stage. How you doing?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure to have you. I've got lighting envy. You're so well lit.
Going for drama.
Looking good there. So thank you for joining us. It's
yeah,
I'm
excited.
Years, but finally we have you at a Film Independent event. So and moderating the conversation is a good friend of Film Independent, producer Heather Ray. Where are you, Heather?
Hi, good evening.
How you doing?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here. Really excited to speak with Bird and thankful to Film Independent.
It's great to have you. For those who don't know Heather, she won the Producers Award at the 2009 Film Independent Spirit Awards for Frozen River. Her other credits include Windwalkers, Tallulah, and Bull. And she's also the exec producer of the series Outer Range, currently on Amazon Prime. So we've got a lot to get through. We've got a Q&A button at the bottom here. So anyone listening in wants to submit a question for Bird, please use the Q&A button. We'll get to questions later. I'm going to leave the chat open for everyone if you want to just kind of share your email addresses or your Insta handles or your any other social handles. But we're going to keep the chat for chat only. Questions in the Q&A, please. But I'm going to step off this virtual stage and leave the two of you to chat. I'll be listening in from backstage. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation with you, Bird. I feel like that you have been in a place in recent times of reflecting on the 20 years that you spent at Sundance and now shifting into being in the space in a different way. And I'm really happy that you are being, recognized. I know you were recently awarded by your grad school, and, you've been really traveling around and talking to folks, which is wonderful. I think that tonight, what I would love to do is, because for a lot of folks may know you and may know your work, but may not know where you come from and really what your background is. So it'd be wonderful if you would just start with talking about, where are you from?
Yeah. Great question. I think the two of the number one questions that I always get is, from most people is always, what do you do? and where are you from? Those are always the first 2 questions I get, no matter where I am in the world. But I come from parents who met at an Indian boarding school in Oklahoma, the Chilocco Indian Boarding School. My mother, Cheyenne, from Western Oklahoma, which is within the former boundaries of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation in Oklahoma, a reservation that was disbanded during the Dawes Act era of American policy. And then my father comes from 2 bands of Apaches, the Mescalero Apache, who our reservation is in southern New Mexico, and that's where I grew up. But interestingly, his grandfather came from the Chiricahua Apache people, who were those who are notoriously associated with Geronimo, the last tribe to surrender in the Indian Wars, and who were subsequently held as prisoners of war of the United States of America. And so, and actually, interestingly, on my mother's tribe side, my great-great-grandmother was also held as a prisoner of war of the United States. And so I think it's particularly, I think, fortuitous for me to end up in this place, coming from very special lineage, I think, and very interesting lineage, not even predating, American occupation and also kind of, the colonization of North America. I always like to show, sometimes when I'm speaking, a map to show the migratory patterns of my family and my tribes coming from my mom's side, coming from the Great Lakes region across the west down south, and then my father's tribe coming from the northern parts of Canada down to where the US-Mexico border is now. And so I like to say that, my genealogy really kind of spans the land of this great North American region, and I'm very proud of it. And so, as a child, I was born and reared on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, grew up without TV. We had to drive about 45 minutes to go catch a movie if we wanted to. And I think that's kind of where my first love of cinema first came about, when my dad, I think when I was 6 years old, took me to go see The Deer Hunter as a way of bonding with me, because he was a Vietnam veteran. Could not figure out what was going on there, but I remembered that movie. And I think in this age of representation, I know people, a lot of us say that, I never saw anybody like me, on television or in films. But one of the things, I think, I feel the same way, but one of the things also that the impact on me was much, much more limited, I feel like, was because, I didn't have that much access to, the screen and to storytelling. And so what I did have at my immediate disposal across the canyon, up the road, down the road, were relatives who were amazing storytellers, and relatives who were religious leaders for our community, who really embedded, within me, our stories of creation and our stories of survival, and going through to, going back to the beginning time up until now. And so that was always my entertainment. And that's where I learned storytelling. And so I ended up going to the University of Oklahoma. I got degrees in journalism and Native American studies. I got a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship to go to graduate school at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. Got a master's degree in public affairs, public policy. And when people ask me, how did I end up in film or television, I really always say wrong place, wrong time, because it was never a goal. It was never an option. It was never even a glimmer anywhere in my being. But the first job I got out of grad school was working for the Ford Foundation, where I helped build the Media, Arts, and Culture program. And due to a lack of program officers and program staff, I myself, as a junior level, program associate, was handed, back in the day, a stack of spreadsheets. This was the 90s, when the internet was still new. But being told, you're going to be managing this global funding portfolio to fund the foundation's work at offices in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Russia, and across the US. And so that was really my baptism, into media, into non-commercial radio, non-commercial TV, non-commercial film. And when I was at Ford, that was actually when you and I first met, because I had to go to Sundance Film Festival when you were working there, representing the Ford Foundation. And it happened to be such a banner year for our community. And I remember the years leading up to that, when we really were questioning within our own community. We had a strong grounding in documentary work, which is a lot of which I helped to fund at Ford. And then there was that question from the community, like, this was 1998, probably years leading up to that, 96 to 98, even before then. The question being asked amongst ourselves was, could we make fiction feature films? Can we make dramatic films? And that year at 1998 really answered that question for us, because the answer was yes. Smoke Signals premiered that year in dramatic competition. Naturally Native by Valerie Red Horse premiered in the Native Forum. Tushka by Ian Scroden was in the Native Forum. So we actually had 3 dramatic feature films written, directed, produced by Native makers for the first time, in modern history. And so, that was a really eye-opening experience for me. And you and I stayed in touch. We became dear friends. I don't know what we're going on, 20, well, we won't count how many years that is.
It's going to be 25.
25 years, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found I found such a great ally and friend in you, a compadre, somebody who I knew was working for this glimmer of an idea that I think many of us had, but we had such a particular way, I think, of trying to kind of nurture and advocate for a screen presence, any kind of screen presence, and all of our roots lie in independent film. So, a couple years after a brief stint with the Rockefeller family, I ended up working at Sundance Institute, and was eventually named the director of the then called Native American program, subsequently the Indigenous program. And it was really a time when I began to, I think, experiment with the program to try to create some type of impact. How can we elevate these numbers of filmmakers, and how can we create more and more films, for not only our festival, but other festivals, and ideally the marketplace. And so one of the things that I'm really proud of, over during my tenure at Sundance was, I think, really being able to help shepherd through kind of like some ideas, and really a definition of sorts of what is an Indigenous film, because I think I witnessed, a lot of non-Indigenous makers, trying to throw a Native storyline in, or trying to find a Native property to tell a Native story, with understanding that Sundance had this commitment that if they told a Native story, they would get into Sundance. And while really trying to hold the space for, if specifically Indigenous makers. And, one of the things that myself and some great collaborators from the Imaginative Film Festival and other global partners, we kind of all eventually, through consensus, agreed that, an Indigenous film is one that is either written, directed, or produced by an Indigenous maker. And so there's a lot of different models of collaboration. Most often, we kind of focused on centering the writer and the director. But, and a lot of times it wasn't even necessarily content driven. It's like we really encourage people, if you are an Indigenous filmmaker, writer, director, you can tell any story. It doesn't have to be, Native American or Indigenous specific, in the center of the story. And I think some of the people that I first began working with, who really kind of took a lot of risks with that once we globalized, the Indigenous program, was Taika Waititi, because Eagle versus Shark was his first feature film, and that's an Indigenous film, and doesn't necessarily have, an Indigenous, story necessarily. And so, it's like, it was a really great time of experimentation and pushing boundaries and redefining boundaries. But I guess by the end of 20 years at Sundance, through working with a number of great teams and colleagues who came and went through the program to help us, define our mission, thanks to the support of our founder, Robert Redford. By the time I left, 154 Indigenous filmmakers were supported through Sundance Labs grants and fellowships, which is, I think it's a pretty healthy, impressive number. When I was a part of the curatorial team at the festival, constantly covering the globe, looking for Indigenous films to be submitted and to be curated into the festival, we had curated about 120 plus films by Indigenous filmmakers to premiere at Sundance Film Festival over the course of 20 years. And just in the last 10 years alone, we welcomed about 95 different indigenous nations through the doors at Sundance. And, you know, those are some numbers that I'm really proud of those numbers, you know, and I think that that really established a true global community, one that was really championing one another, one that was really trying to defy the notion of us competing against one another, you know, because we were all in it together. We're all trying to make a difference in our own communities, and especially, you know, most significantly, Native American screens.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for all of that. Something I want to ask you that is connected to your own, you know, upbringing and how and where you grew up, and also connected to the work at large, is how do your teachings inform your work? And how do you feel that Indigenous teachings can inform the work?
Wow, how long do we have?
We got a while. So,
okay.
yeah.
You know, I just got off the phone with my niece because she's doing a report on our Mescalero tribe, and I was reminding her, you know, some of the things that we went home for this summer, which was when one of her cousins, another niece of mine, had her coming of age ceremony, her puberty ceremony, and I was explaining all the metaphors about, you know, about being a matrilineal tribe, a community rooted in matriarchy, and, you know, going back to the creation and creation narrative and beginning of time, and our first person being a woman. And so I think, in terms of one of the most significant teachings that I think has really influenced me, has been, you know, to feel ultimately so comfortable with powerful women, the leadership of women, the centering of women, because those are all the things that come from me, from my Mescalero tribal culture, you know. And, you know, if I would to say, like, back in the day when I was redesigning the Native Lab at Sundance, you know, I really toyed with a lot of different methodologies, a lot of different approaches, but ultimately, you know, I really tried to call upon my own traditional Mescalero, my Apache teachings, you know, the sacredness of the number 4. We made the lab 4 days, just like we do 4-day ceremonies back home. I actually, at one point through Sundance, relocated the Native Lab to my own home reservation to have our lab on Native land, you know, and as a way of really kind of recentering the discussions of Indigenous storytelling, because for us to be on Native land and to be surrounded in a Native community, we, all of our Indigenous fellows, were kind of the norm, you know, our discussions were the norm. And also, when we had, you know, and I also upheld this commitment that we would have one half what we call creative advisors who were Indigenous as well. You know, so if we had 4 creative advisors, at least 2 of them had to be Indigenous, and we included people like Rachel Perkins from Australia, Bet Cole from Australia, the late Merita Mitta from New Zealand. You know, Taika Waititi was a creative advisor, and then also people like Sterling Harjo, and he was another early writer, that filmmaker that I worked with on his first films at Sundance. And, you know, and so, but when we always had 2 non-Indigenous advisors, and it was always interesting to me to watch the non-Indigenous advisor experience coming into a reservation community, coming into a Native lab that was really centering, you know, Indigenous thought and Indigenous culture and Indigenous practice, because I feel like so many film discussions and filmmaking discussions are all so patriarchal and so centered on a Eurocentric kind of Euro-American worldview. And filmmaking, you know, while it was established within those frameworks, you know, a lot of the work of Indigenous filmmakers is really trying to dismantle that and trying to redefine, you know, storytelling, filmic storytelling from an Indigenous point of view. And that lab model was one of the first experiments that that I did, through, thankfully, that Sundance let me do, to try to create more impact, And so, it included, having a welcome feast, and my aunt would put up a teepee and cook traditional food, and my family would come out and just so excited to meet all of the guests that I was bringing to our community. We'd have a community screening night, where we invited the community to come watch films from some of the, the advisors who were in the lab. We showed Casey Lemons's films when she came to be an advisor at the lab, so many other people, Joan Tewksbury, and it was just so great creating kind of a cross-cultural kind of milkshake, if you will, of cinema on the Mescalero Apache Reservation for a number of years. And of course, there were blessings, there were prayers, there were excursions. There always happened to be some type of dance or cultural event, a ceremony. Sometimes these puberty ceremonies were going on while our lab was happening, and we would take our whole lab out to that ceremony to observe and to watch and to even sometimes participate and to share in the bounty and the generosity of celebrating, a young woman coming to adulthood. So, there's all of these inflections that that are me. That I've been very privileged to really be able to bring to my work to really redefine so much of our approach, because as we know, our statistics haven't been that great, and there's a lot of reasons why our statistics aren't that great in this industry.
Will you talk about that? You sit on the board of directors for Illuminative, an organization that has done a tremendous amount of work in the last 3 to 4 years, founded in research. And I would love if you would share some of that research, because I think that it's really, it can be shocking, it's compelling. A lot of folks don't know, much of what Illuminative has discovered as an organization that is research founded. It'd be great if you would share some of that information.
Yeah. Well, Illuminative is an organization that was women-led and run by Indigenous women. And they, prior to its founding, they were commissioned by a number of funders and foundations to really do, for the first time ever, a national survey to identify and to understand what did Americans think of Native Americans. They surveyed, I think they spent to the tune of $3.3 million. They surveyed every demographic, every age group, every racial group. They surveyed senators, congressmen, judges, tribal leaders. They surveyed everyone. They did online analysis of looking at content, that you find through Google searches, and looking at measuring how much of our imagery appears on screen. And so two of the things that they found, which you and I knew from just trying to do this work, for so long, was that we were suffering from two things: invisibility and misrepresentation. And the reasons why that was happening, which were things that we already knew, but I guess we never really knew that there was a data point or a percentage point associated with it. But they found that nearly 80% of Americans don't know that Native Americans exist today as contemporary American people. And so one of the things that they kind of, after digging deeper into responders and surveys, they found that, and also surveying educational curriculum across our country, they found that 27 states don't mention Native Americans in K through 12 curriculum. So we kind of are, we're experiencing an erasure in the American education system. And then also 87% fail to cover Native people's history past the year 1900. So we're always, what little we are taught about in schools, we're always existing in the past. And so, even the number of, they looked at Google researches. At one point, they found that 90% of Google research, whenever you type in something, you're trying to find something Native American, it is always 90% of the time 1800s or prior to 1800s photographs and imagery. And so, all of that compounded, I would say, also with the great affection and affinity that, our film industry has for the Western as a colonial tool, compounded by these other elements, these other really striking findings. that leads to basically we have 0.04% representation on screen in film and television. And I think the number might be shifting slightly because we do have some TV shows, but also the amount of content has really grown so much. We've seen a proliferation of content, and not necessarily a broader level of inclusion of stories. So that number is kind of remaining the same.
One thing I'll add to, all the information you shared, which is so important, and a lot of folks don't know this, but Hollywood built its foundational wealth on the Western. So essentially, Hollywood built its foundational wealth on the backs of the misrepresentation of Indigenous people, in North America. And so that, there was a heavy price paid by Native peoples for the ways in which Hollywood has so, egregiously misrepresented, the original people. And it's starting to shift. And that's something I want to shift into with you. Everything that you described in terms of the work that you did at Sundance over 2 decades, it really built an important foundation. And I think that, absolutely. And I think that we can talk about things with that context in mind, but also let's talk about things in a post-Standing Rock world. I'm interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah. Well, Standing Rock was such an amazing galvanizing tool, I feel like, for so many of us of our generation. I think so many of us had heard a lot of the great stories going back to the American Indian movement and the occupation at Alcatraz and, the standoff at Wounded Knee, where, community came together to really defend a cause and to really kind of fight for something. And Standing Rock was that moment, and but it also happened during an age of social media, and so I really, I don't know, I really credit, this growth moment that we're having, this very significant moment that we're having of having our first Native American TV shows, on streamers, having our very first Native American showrunners running these shows, writers' rooms full of Indigenous writers, 100%, shows directed by, Indigenous directors. None of that would have really happened if we didn't have water protectors and if we didn't have land protectors who were on the ground, on the front lines, being sprayed with rubber bullets and water hoses, all in the name of, capitalistic expansion. And, it was so amazing because one of the things that was also happening was a media blackout. It was the same thing that happened in Wounded Knee, which was going on back in 1973, where it was a very intentional blackout that these stories weren't being covered by our national press. And so then thankfully, because of social media, because the people on the ground there and our communities and allies were really, really trying to tell the story and trying to push as much as we could information out. That was really what shifted, in the newsrooms of like the New York Times and all the major news outlets on TV, was because a lot of millennial people who were getting a lot of information from, their social media of what was happening at Standing Rock, were able to finally persuade their, the older generations, the editors running everything, that this was a story that needed to be covered. And so I really do make that linkage and connection back, because it wasn't until Standing Rock that, at that point, I had been in my job, I think, for maybe 15 years. And hardly ever did we ever get financing for a Native American film. We were always working in the micro budget range from anywhere from 50,000 to the highest level of probably 200,000, for all the years that I tried to help, Sterling Harjo make his feature films, and, Black Horse Lowe and Sidney Freeland and Andrew McLean and, all of these brilliant Native filmmakers who are now, doing pretty good because they stuck with it and they created films and they had a body of work to show for it. Because when Standing Rock happened, all of a sudden we were on the front page of the New York Times again. We were on the national news and everybody was reading about us in New York Times Magazine. All all of a sudden people began flooding my office because they were like, I need to be including Native talent in my work, in film and television. And that's where I really effectively started acting like an agent or a manager, really just because none of them had representation. No agencies would ever sign any of our Native talent, and none of their films ever got acquired for distribution. So there's actually a whole significant amount of Native American work that is not, you can't locate it anywhere on any streamer or on any digital platform, because none of the work was ever, acquired out of, world premieres at Sundance Film Festival and other places. And so there's a lot of systemic flaws, but, one of the things I'm really proud of, again, going back to the tenacity of our community and the family that we were able to build, we really just stuck with it and just kind of kept creating the work, kept churning out the work, kept challenging one another's to push form, to experiment with genre, style, so many different kind of tone, so many different approaches to really kind of expand the language of Indigenous cinema. Because I felt like, because we were constantly working in the shadows of the Western, it's like that people did not have, and given these statistics, where the American education system has failed almost every decision maker and every person working in our industry, it's like there was no entree point for our peers to access the work, because they just did not know that we didn't exist. And then there was also another flaw in the acquisitions argument, was that there was no audience for Native work. There weren't enough Native Americans to count as an audience to sell tickets to. And I think one of the things that we always were trying to say is like, our work is for everybody else. Yes, our audience is a benefit, an audience that we could benefit from, but somebody, nobody could ever really would ever take the risk and could ever understand through a distribution strategy that the work was meant for broader audiences. And I think with the success of Reservation Dogs, we're really seeing that the reason why that film is so successful is because it really straddles audiences across the board and even globally.
Yeah. And we also learned from Illuminative's research that 78% of Americans want to know more about Native Americans. Mm-hmm. So we have this incredible gap between 0.4% of representation in American film and television and almost 80% of audience, in the United States wanting to know more. That's a massive market share that's, that's really based in some kind of internalized rhetoric that wasn't real, Mm-hmm. So I think that, there's a lot to say about what has happened, and even since the murder of George Floyd.
Exactly. And that was another significant point, because post Standing Rock, I was just constantly being hit up for talent, writers, directors, producers, all Sundance alumni, people who had been curated into Sundance Film Festival, or people who had been curated into a lab, people we had worked with, to get their films made. I think at last count, I can't recall, but I think I helped make, through Sundance, about 40 different films.
Wow.
And, and then when the George Floyd moment happened, I kind of thought, well, there went our window. That was it. It's like, now with the centering of Black Lives Matter, with this really important social issue at hand, we were standing, in solidarity and with as allies to the Black community. And I thought that was it, like now everything, the tide is going to shift towards, Black makers and Black storytellers, which, we should all be able to be focused on, ideally at the same time. But actually, with the touting of BIPOC, when that really came about and people started to understand that the I in BIPOC meant Indigenous, it also, a lot of people continually started to reaching out, because they said that they felt like that, they didn't know where else to go, to sort, to suss, Indigenous talent, to that the I in BIPOC was their blind spot. And so it actually, things really picked up even more so than after Standing Rock. And so it's just been a really great, interesting moment. A lot of promises and commitments by our industry were made during that time. I kind of wonder if it's going to be a sustaining moment, or if it's just a trend. You know, I think once we start seeing, you know, business model shifting and lose loss of subscribers, I think that's definitely impacting what gets cut first, you know. So I don't know, it remains to be seen, but I'm really hoping that you know, a lot of this investment and this inclusion essentially of Indigenous talent continues.
Let's lead into that for a little bit more for a second, because talking about the future and identifying this is not just a trending moment. You know, there's been a few trending moments over the course of, you know, even our time working in the industry. There was 1992 with Dances with Wolves, and, you know, some of the content that was created that was a trend. It was around the quincentennial. That was a trending moment, and it didn't last. Then there was another point at the turn of the century, which you referenced, with, you know, Smoke Signals, and a number of films that were made at that time also did not really last, didn't have staying power. So what about now? Like, how do we really ensure, and does something feel different about these times, so that we begin to feel as though Indigenous stories and Indigenous content creators are being woven into the fabric of the American psyche?
Mm-hmm. That is another good question. You know, one of the things I think that's different about this moment is having people who have hiring power in place, people who are showrunners, you know, on the TV side, people who are showrunners. So Sterling Harjo, showrunner for Reservation Dogs, he's hired, you know, an all native writers room. You know, he gave for over two seasons, all 100% native directors their first TV directing jobs. You know, he took a risk on them. You know, he got behind them, and he worked with them to direct their first episodic work. And so now that they have, you know, a credit under their belt, they're able to kind of access, you know, the system a bit more. You know, we see a lot more, almost all of the writers and all of the directors all now have, you know, representation. They have agents. I kind of like, I pay attention to the rosters of WME and CAA and Gersh, and they're all kind of like neck and neck, you know, with their numbers that they're signing, you know, in terms of some of the top tier agencies. And, you know, and that's a first, you know, in our engagement and involvement with the American industry. It's like we never have been included, you know, in the representation world. Almost all of them also have managers. They also obviously all have entertainment lawyers. So, you know, it's a really fascinating development to kind of see this influx of talent into the system. It's like a blood transfusion that really needed to happen into that system needed a blood transfusion, and it's getting some, you know, some red blood there. Pardon the pun.
I like it.
But, you know, that's a first. And then also, if I start to look even, you know, maybe even a little bit more closely, you know, Sierra Ornelas, our first showrunner, who was a woman. I always knew it was going to be a woman who was going to perforate through that boundary. With Rutherford Falls, you know, sadly her now canceled show from Peacock, but, you know, she has an overall deal at Universal, you know, and will keep making work and is continually developing new shows for them. Sterling has an overall deal at FX for his TV work. So everything and I just hear him, he's taking, you know, so many great pals, colleagues, peers of ours from the Indigenous community in there to pitch with shows, and they're buying, you know, they're buying in the room, you know, it's amazing.
You know, it's interesting how what Sterling has been doing is really similar a lot to what Ava DuVernay has been doing, like with Queen Sugar. You know,
Absolutely.
I mean, that door is kicked open and they're pulling as many people through that door with them as they possibly can. And that really is what it's going to take, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know,
what's your call to action?
Well, I did want to finish up with one thing before I answer that.
Yes, yeah.
There are two other people besides Sterling and Sierra, you know, who have deals. I myself have a deal with Amazon Studios, and Michael Grey Eyes has a deal with Bloomhouse Media. you know,
That's
and
right.
so that is a first as well. And you know, Taika has to deal with FX as well, but you know, from the American point of view, it's like that's a first as well for Native people to have studio deals, because that recognizes the great business possibilities of being in business with the Native community. And I
Absolutely.
think that's a significant stride for us, besides the agents and the managers and whatnot. But I just definitely wanted to mention that point. But you know, the call to action, I think, you know, when I was the head of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion at Sundance right before I left, you know, post George Floyd, where we were really interrogating our systems for white supremacy, you know, really taking program by program, staff member by staff member through so much training and questioning and assessment of really looking to see where white supremacy lived within our organization, within our practices, within our programs. You know, it was a really eye-opening moment for me, because I kind of came to realize that I had been dependent entirely from Ford Foundation to Rockefeller Family to Sundance Institute and now to Amazon. Like, I had always been dependent on allies, because I was always the only Native American person in every space I walked into. So it's not like I could call upon, you know, my fellow Native folks in the room, or, you know, kind of collaborate with other Native people in the space, because I was the only one. I was always the only one. And so I'm so happy to not be the only one anymore with this new moment we're having. And so my methodology was always about seeking out great allies across racial lines, across cultural lines, across gender lines, across lines of sexuality. You know, I always had to try to find partners and allies who were willing to, you know, help with, you know, the vision, with you know, the movement, with what we're trying to build and trying to achieve. And so that's one of the things that I look at in this moment that we're having, and also kind of how we got here to this moment we're having. Sterling had a great champion with Taika Waititi, you know, who Oscar winner now, and a great for business. You know, he was really the one that took Reservation Dogs into FX and kind of said, you know, you guys need to make this show. And if you're not going to make it, we're going to take it elsewhere. And that really kind of putting his reputation and name on the line. Ava DuVernay, you know, approached me to work with her on a Native American television drama that we're still in development on, you know, and, you know, one of the questions, this was 2 years ago, I remember her asking me, she said, how many Native American showrunners are there? And I was like, at that point, I said, none. And she said, don't worry about it. We'll make some more. We'll make some, you know? And she said, how many TV writers are there? I said, staffed? And she said, yes. I said, 2? And she's like, don't worry about it. We'll make more, you know? And at that point, I think Sydney Freeland was the only Native American directing for television. She had directed like 1 episode of Grey's Anatomy. And this was just 2 years ago, you know? And I think now between Rutherford Falls, you know, AMC's Dark Winds, and, you know, Res Dogs, I mean, I bet we have probably at least 20 to 25, you know, TV directors working today. And now doing network TV, cable TV, all different shows on platforms. So I just go to say, you know, we need allies like that. I'm collaborating with Ethan Hawke on another show that we've set up. You know, we have our good friend Lynette Howell Taylor also. You know, she approached us to looking for a Comanche consultant to work with the project on her. And we were like, Lynette, help us out. Be our ally. You know, don't do the cultural consultant model. Bring on a Native producer, somebody who actually is a part of the core creative decision-making team, who can really have some weight, you know, and she did, you know, and that project that Lynette was working on has now morphed and is becoming something else. And this producer is still attached, but, you know, her name is Jane Myers. And she went on while that project was morphing and going a different direction that she's coming back to. She went off and worked with, you know, with Fox, to create Prey on Hulu, 20th Century Studios, and that was Hulu's #1 debut of all time, even beating out the Kardashians on Hulu. And you're granted, you could say, okay, is it a half step forward, half step back, because it's a period piece, as much as we lament period pieces, but that one has so much authenticity to it. I told Jane that film has your fingerprints in every frame because she's Comanche. It's the Comanche tribe in that Hulu. We're being injected into a franchise, albeit a period piece. It's a whole new redefinition, of that. And I know Jane's going to be appearing on one of these panels sometime pretty soon. But I just want to say, we can't sustain this growth moment. We can't keep building on this growth moment without allies. We need more allies. We need more producers. We need more showrunners to bring us into the room, to bring us into the storytelling process on an expansive array of content, not just Indigenous content, because our storytellers are so well-versed and so prolific and such cineasts and, and some of the most well-read, well-taught, students of, cinematic history, and TV. And so it can only enrich the work by including Native talent.
Beautiful. Thank you, Bird, so much for sharing so much of yourself and, your own history and story and the work that you've been doing for so long. You and I have been alongside one another, trying to make a difference in this industry. And I just really appreciate you and, utmost respect.
Thank you.
And love being able to have this conversation. So there's just a couple of questions thus far that's in the Q&A here. And the first is from Steve asking about Westerns. And can you see their questions, Bird?
No, hold on, let me look.
If you go to
Q&A. Oh, there we are.
Yeah.
Okay. I've never been a big fan of Westerns, a ridiculous mythology. Okay. I've always wanted to see one from the POV of Native Americans or immigrants about early colonial America. Do we expect to see more or a TV series made into one? Yes, I will say that. One of the interesting things when my deal was first announced, every producer in town reached out to me, every agency, everybody wanting to put projects in front of me. And I would say 95% of them were period piece, most often Westerns. And with absolutely just replicating the historic lens of what a Western was. And, we kind of look at the Western as, it's kind of all about westward expansion. It's all about the expansion of America, and the Indian always has to die in order for America to live, right? So that's kind of the metaphor. And so I said, no Westerns. Then, to be fair, I took on 2 Westerns, 2 period pieces. One I can't talk about. It's a TV show centering, one of my tribes. But and also, looking at another project from, that was on the blacklist last year, Black Horse Lowe's feature, Lords of the Earth. But when I look at those two, I look at them as really radical shifts of the lens on that time period. I think Black Horse even used the term anti-Western, to be able to put the story into the eyes and the hands of the Native person centered in the story who is experiencing it, not being somebody who's cast as a background extra or somebody who's, consequentially there to die, so that the narrative can move forward. And so I do know that, I think that there are other projects like that. I think that it's absolutely something that is going to redefine American cinema when it does happen, and American television when it happens, because I don't think most American audiences, just like 80% of people don't know Native Americans exist, I think probably about 80% of Americans don't understand the basic metaphor of, a Western and what it represents in terms of, American history.
Yeah, I think it's really important in terms of, changing the narrative, the reflective narrative. And from what I know of most contemporary Native content creators, they want to tell contemporary stories. You know,
Yeah.
that's so often where people's interest is.
Or futuristic, for that matter.
Or futuristic, indigenous futurisms, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's another question here, Bird, asking about, you know, the changes in the industry and opportunities to develop BIPOC executive showrunners and such.
Yeah. Oh, you know, that was something I forgot to comment on. We have 3 Native American executives working in this industry right now. You know, it's exciting. We never used to have any. I kind of, just for lack of a better word, was often called an executive while I was at Sundance, even though I never really considered myself an executive. But you know, it was you know, slim pickings. Really trying to go to different kinds of, you know, places to try to seek financing, or to try to seek allies and partners to kind of really help bring forward and support, you know, indigenous stories. And so some of the programs, you know, yes, I think there is a need for BIPOC executives and showrunners. But one of the things that I really, I don't know, that I contemplate often is that if we have executives who are kind of just churning the, you know, the wheels of money making, which is at the root of what our industry is, you know, it's kind of an automatic default that the same cookie cutter template is going to work to create those stories, you know.
Yeah.
And even if you're a BIPOC executive using, you know, an antiquated cookie cutter to create BIPOC content, I don't know if that's necessarily going to create sustainability or really create innovation, you know. One of the things that I'm proud of in a lot of the feature films that I help make within that, you know, body of 40 films, because they were such micro budgets, and because they were such small, you know, resources to make films, the filmmakers were really able to make the films on their own terms. You know, they most often were made in their own communities. They modified the production model. It wasn't a typical hierarchical model. You know, they created more culturally based models. You know, other filmmakers kind of even went so much as, even if they weren't filming that film in their own home community, they were filming it on another tribe's ancestral lands. They did, you know, kind of curriculum for everyone to become culturally competent, essentially, to understand whose land they were on and historically what happened in that place, and then to understand, you know, the indigenous makers of this film, you know, and were kind of redefining the production model away from a hierarchical model and also becoming a women-centered model. You know, there's so much experimentation, you know, and those created some of the richest stories and some of the most beautiful films that I had the great pleasure of supporting, that really traveled globally, you know. And you know, they also, I just think, for studios and networks and other, you know, content creators, you know, I think if you really want to be a great ally, I think it'd be really great to really reconsider the production model for an indigenous-led production to tell a great story.
Yeah, beautiful. We just have a few minutes left. There are 2 questions, Bird, if you want to take a look and feel like that you can answer one or both of those questions.
Yeah. Yes. We've spoken about the importance of allyship. How can we, as up and coming filmmakers without much influence yet, be better allies for indigenous filmmakers?
That's a great question. It's so sweet.
It is. And I think that, you know, like, some of my alumni from the Sundance Lab have gone on and, you know, have been grad students at the NYU film program. And for some of them, it's really the first time they've been away from a native environment, you know? And so they've really had to kind of create allyships and friendships and partners, you know, within their school in order to kind of bring their short films into fruition and whatnot. And I think that, you know, wherever there might be, and also I also understand there's tension point between Indigenous community and non-Indigenous people and the historical mining of our communities for stories. And so there's a great cautionary point that, you know, when you're working and approaching Indigenous filmmakers to become an ally, to make sure that you're not coming across as somebody who's there to mine a story, you know, somebody who's to take, you know, story away and make it your own and you know, whatnot. And so, you know, I think that there just has to become, you know, a really strong element of bonding and
Reciprocity.
Reciprocity, yeah, becoming a part of a shared community in a way, and also being willing to honor what is being centered, you know, because for too long, so much whiteness and white maleness has been centered. So it's nice to kind of, I think, be able to decenter that and be centering other things that are more indigenous and paying the respect, giving it the respect that it deserves.
Beautiful. There's one last question, Brett, about what you're working on. You've mentioned a couple of things you're working on now that you have shifted into the role of producing and content creating. Do you want to just make mention and we'll wrap up in terms of like what your slate looks like and what you're excited about?
Yeah, well, I'm involved as an EP with a film by Erica Tremblay, who is a Seneca Cayuga filmmaker. And she just wrapped shooting in Oklahoma on her film Fancy Dance, which is a film that went through the Sundance Labs, and her first short went through Sundance Film Festival. So it's really exciting to see her spread her wings as a Native woman writing and directing a feature film. And I watched a rough cut and I told her, I was like, you know, I would venture to say that you're joining the club of like 2 previous Native American women who have directed feature films. So you're number 3. And, you know, the club is only going to keep growing, you know. Sydney Freeland was the first, and then also Rihanna Yazzie as well, who made a small independent film, and now Erica. And then, you know,
Canada, but in the US.
Yeah, more in Canada, but in the United States, you know, it's been a tougher uphill climb. Like I mentioned, Sovereign with Ava, my co-creators on that are Sydney Freeland and Shaz Bennett. That's still in development. I do have a show set up with Ethan Hawke and Sterling Harjo, and then at another place. And then I also have a show that I'm working on with you, Heather, at Amazon, which is a really great genre sci-fi piece. And then also, you know, the feature with Black Horse Low that we're really trying to, you know, really push the financing boundaries on that one, because, you know, while our numbers have grown in the financing game from back in the day from like 50K, recent times films in indie films are kind of being financed in the $1 to $2 million range, which is pretty significant. But I think we can go higher than that.
Yeah.
And so can our industry.
Bird, thank you so much. I've learned things about you, and I've known you for a long, long time. And there was things I really learned from talking with you, and just appreciate, you know, the depth that you have in terms of how you think about the work and the care and respect that you have for talent and the way in which you work with people. It's just, it's wonderful. So I will say collectively, we are really, really grateful for you. And thank you to everyone for being here with us and being a part of this conversation wherever you are in the world. And with that, I think we can close out.
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Film Independent. And I look forward to seeing everyone out there fighting the fight.
Absolutely.